One of the main reasons computers slow down is that over time, as you install stuff, those things may add themselves to be automatically started up on Logon. And the usual place you might look to disable these startup programs, the task manager, doesn't cover all the bases. So in this video, I'm going to go over all the different possible places in Windows that a program could be hiding to start up in the background. Even if you don't even use the program ever, you might not know that it's still starting up. So first, relatively quickly, I'll go through all the different locations that a startup program may be, and then we can go into a little bit more detail on a tool that Microsoft actually publishes, but it's not included with Windows, that lets you look at all of these startup locations all at once and manage it. I'm really surprised this tool isn't included with Windows, but you'll find out about it. All right, now for checking startup programs, the first place to start, probably you're already familiar with, which is the task manager. You can easily bring it up with the shortcut Control-Shift-Escape. And then of course in there you'll see the startup tab to go to. This tab will show some of the startup programs starting with Windows, possibly even most, but not all. And even if you have been in here before, you might not have known about some extra info you can display, which is useful, and even I didn't know about these before researching the video. So if you right click at the top of a column, you can enable other columns for info. And you must click an existing column, just clicking an empty spot won't do it. One of the useful columns is startup type, which will show you the source of that particular startup entry. So it could be a folder, which I'll go over next. It could be a registry entry, or it could just be blank, in which case it's probably from the Microsoft Store. But again, this doesn't cover all the possibilities, but we will. Another column is disk I/O at startup. So this tells you how much data is written and read from the disk when it's booting up. So maybe if you notice your computer slowing down, your hard drive going crazy at startup, and you're wondering why, you can look to see what programs are using so much data. But keep in mind, that doesn't mean it's downloading data, it's just reading from the disk into memory or something. There's also CPU at startup, which shows you the amount of time that each program takes to boot up fully, I guess. Although I'm not sure how super accurate this is because it says that Steam takes over like 4 minutes to start up, but I don't know. There's also disabled time, which if you did disable it from starting up, it'll tell you when. And then command line shows you the exact program or command that gets executed on startup. So this could be useful if you're not even sure what a program is or where it is or something, or what exactly it's doing. So using the task manager for this is pretty straightforward. You just look through the list, find ones you don't want, and you can just right click and disable it from starting up. Next, let's talk about startup folders in Windows, which are special folders where anything you put into it, including a shortcut to a program will run the program, or a script, all of that gets run at startup. Getting to these is actually really easy if you know the shortcuts. So go into the start menu and then type in run to bring up the run dialog box, and then just type in shell:startup. And this will take you to your user folder, app data, roaming, Microsoft, Windows, start menu, programs, and then startup is the full path. And the other one you can access by instead typing shell:common startup. And this takes you to see program data, Microsoft, Windows, start menu, programs, startup. The reason there are two is the one is just for the individual user who's logged in. So each user is going to have each of their own, and it might start up different programs. Whereas the one in program data is for all users. It's going to start up for the whole system. And what's good is when a program or something is added into these folders, it does get added and listed in the task manager startup tab. So it's not like you have to keep checking these constantly. For example, you can see I make this test.batch file, and then when I put it in, it now shows up in the task manager. But this is still good to know about because maybe you do want to just completely delete a shortcut so it doesn't even show in task manager. And it's also very useful if you want to personally add a program that starts up with Windows that doesn't by default. Or maybe you want to add a script or something yourself, like a batch file, you can have it run at startup. Before we continue, I want to thank today's sponsor, Blinkist. I'm sure many of you, like me, wish you read more but can't always quite find the time. And that's where Blinkist comes in. This app takes thousands of top nonfiction books and creates much shorter text and audio explainers they call blinks. In around 15 minutes each, you can learn the key takeaways from thousands of titles in 27 different categories, from science to psychology, investing, personal development, and more. For example, you may have heard of the famously long book, The Wealth of Nations, which is an absolute unit that has been sitting on my shelf unread for years. But now, in just 9 minutes, I was able to listen to the key points. And if you want, you can even crank up the speed for that. One of the top sellers I'm familiar with is Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, which I did read a long time ago, but forgot most of it, so Blinkist was able to give me a pretty good recap. So I'd say it's also good for recaps, and also maybe if you want to get the gist of a book before deciding whether to read the whole thing. So if you want to try it out, the first 100 people to go to Blinkist.com/TheoJoe will get a 1-week unlimited free trial to try it out. And yes, the trial is completely free, and you can cancel it at any time, but if you do decide to get a full membership, you'll also get 25% off that. So again, you can go to blinkist.com/TheoJoe, and the same link will also be in the description if you want to check it out. So now, let's continue. Next, real quick, let's mention the different registry locations that are mentioned in the Task Manager as well. I'm not going to dig into these in too much detail because you can just edit it through the Task Manager. You don't have to use the registry, which can sometimes be risky. Basically, there are 6 different locations I found when researching. I don't believe there's any others, but you never know. Anyway, 2 of them are for startup programs for the current user, and one is for 32-bit and one is for 64-bit. 2 are for the whole computer, and also there's one 32-bit and 64-bit. And the last 2 keys are, one is for the user and one is for the system, but these include both enabled and disabled startup items. So that's why if you disable something in the Task Manager, it still shows, because it just gets removed from the active one and just kept in the disabled one. Again, I wouldn't recommend messing with the registry for these, but I just wanted to include it for thoroughness. All right, now next is a big one, which are Windows services. Services, by definition, are programs that run in the background. You can actually see a tab with a list of services in Task Manager, but you can't change anything in there. You can instead click on Open Services at the bottom, or type in services.msc into the start menu to bring up the actual services management console. Now, word of warning, do not change or do anything in this menu yet. A lot of these services are built into Windows and required by it, so if you don't know what you're messing with, it could mess with things. And later I'm going to show you a way to easily filter out all the Windows stuff so it's just showing third-party stuff. We'll get into all that. Anyway, many times when you install a program, it may also install a service or multiple ones which run in the background and are separate from the front-end part of the program. This is not necessarily bad, just something to be aware of. And you'll also notice in here many of the services have the startup type listed as manual. This means that it's only going to be run if it is requested by something else, such as being run by the front-end program that you choose to run. So that's not a big deal. Some programs don't need to be running all the time, so they only run when they are needed. And if it is a service that's running, it should show up in the Task Manager under running processes, though there might be a lot to sort through. However, sometimes programs will have their service run at startup, which again, there might be a legitimate reason for it. If it is something that kind of does need to be run in the background all the time, like an antivirus, that's fine. But other times, it's programs that really have no business running automatically all the time in the background and starting up with Windows. And the worst part is if it's a service, it's probably not going to show up just in the taskbar, so you might not even realize what's going on. But again, don't go changing anything in here yet. I'm going to go over that later. So the last place I'm going to mention at this point where a program could be starting up is through the Task Scheduler. This can be found by searching it in the Start menu, and this is another legitimate useful feature in Windows. It lets you just do stuff on a schedule. And sometimes programs use this to start up with Windows, maybe to hide it, maybe legitimately. Sometimes there's a lot of update services you'll notice in here, which, they might be running on a schedule like once a week to check for an update. That's reasonably okay, I would say. But if it's just a program that is purely using it to start up and avoid kind of showing up in the Task Manager, obviously that's not great. All right, so now that we know all the possible different startup locations, let's go over a tool I was mentioning, which is called Autoruns. It's actually part of the Sysinternals suite, it's called, which is actually published by Microsoft officially. It's just not included with Windows, surprisingly, because it's so useful. And you can see it has a bunch of different tabs for all the stuff that we already went over, and then some more, very easily accessible, so we'll look at those in a second. Before I show you how to do anything though, I need to warn you, because Autoruns is very useful, but it is also very powerful. And it has the potential, if you delete or disable the wrong thing, to make your computer not bootable. So what I would recommend doing is don't actually change anything in Autoruns. Use it to just kind of find programs that might be starting up, but then actually use the things we already talked about, like the Task Manager or the Services window or something like that, to actually disable it from starting up or changing the startup type in services, for example. Especially because there are some things where you think you'll be able to reverse a change in Autoruns, but you can't. So it's not really worth the risk. And if you don't follow my warning, then that's completely on you, of course. But that being said, let's go over how to get it. So you can download the Sysinternals suite from Microsoft's website. I'll put the link in the description. And then you can see that there are a ton of tools in here. So I definitely recommend looking these up if you're curious yourself. I'm only going to talk about this one, which is Autoruns. Now you can download the whole Sysinternals suite as a zip file and it'll all be in there. However, because the suite is updated so frequently, for example, you can see Autoruns was updated like twice in the past month. I would recommend using an option that Microsoft has for this called a live folder. And this is really cool. Let me show you how it works. So anywhere on your computer, just make a new shortcut and then make the link to this. It's //live.sysinternals.com and then @SSL and all this stuff. And I'll put that string of text in the description so you can just copy and paste it. And then when you go to name it, you can name it whatever. Now, what this type of shortcut does is every time you go into that shortcut, it will actually connect to the Sysinternals server and automatically get a list of all the latest versions of the software. I don't believe it actually downloads it every single time, but when you actually go to run it, it'll then fetch that particular file. But this way you'll know that every time you run it, you will be getting the latest version. Of course, if you need the programs offline, you can always just download it and put it on a USB or something. If you're curious how this folder works, it uses a protocol called WebDAV. You can just look that up. Anyway, so whether you downloaded the file or you used a live folder, next we want to run Autoruns64.exe. There's also one that's just called Autoruns. That's the 32-bit version, but you may as well use the 64. And also you might have to run it as an administrator for some functions, just keep that in mind. So when you run Autoruns, you can see that it basically is a tool that shows you every possible way something could be starting up with Windows, and we'll go over some that you probably didn't even expect. Each of the tabs at the top is for one of these different methods. Some of them you might notice are completely empty, some of them only have like a couple things in there, and some are going to be the main ones. But one of the best features about this tool is if you go to the top to options, you can then check hide Microsoft entries, and you can also make sure hide Windows entries is also checked. This should be pretty self-explanatory, but it makes it really easy to only show basically third-party programs and stuff and ignore anything that might be a super critical Windows file. That of course doesn't mean you can go around just disabling and deleting whatever you want, but it just makes it a little bit more as a convenience. Looking at the tabs, a few of them correspond to what we already looked at. The Logon tab shows basically everything that you would have seen in the Task Manager startup tab, including startup folders. However, take careful notice because this does work differently than what we were doing in Task Manager. Notice how all the entries here on the left have checkboxes checked regardless of whether or not they're disabled in the Task Manager. So the checkbox doesn't actually just disable it. If you uncheck a box in Autoruns in this particular tab, it will actually just completely remove it from the Task Manager in addition to disabling it. So like I said before, I would not recommend unchecking it or anything in Autoruns to disable it. Just use the Task Manager. It's way more easily reversible. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about this one and come back to it in a second. So let's look at the Schedule Tasks tab. This one, as you expect, shows everything that we saw in the Task Scheduler. However, notice how in this tab in Autoruns, it actually does sync up with what is enabled and disabled in this Task Scheduler in terms of what's checked there. So anything that's disabled as a task in Task Scheduler, it will also show as unchecked automatically in Autoruns. And we can see that here. If we disable this in Task Scheduler, then if we refresh Autoruns, it'll automatically uncheck it. All right, now let's look at the Services tab, which again, I'm gonna spend probably a little bit more time on because it is possibly the most useful tab, though it is the most nuanced, so pay careful attention. Notice how in Autoruns, the Services tab has so few entries compared to the regular Services window. That's because we had hid Microsoft and Windows entry, which makes our job a lot easier. Now, what I would actually recommend is not using Autoruns to actually change anything. Just use it to kind of find the different third-party services you want to look at or see if they're already in there you want to disable, and then also use the main services window in conjunction with that and change anything in the services window, not Autoruns. And that's because Autoruns only lets you fully disable a service, which is rarely what we want to do. Because remember, some of these services are required for certain programs to actually work. We just don't necessarily want some of them starting up with Windows automatically, but we still want them to be able to run, which disabling just blocks it completely, as far as my understanding. Also, one thing to point out is the checkboxes next to services in Autoruns only shows you whether or not a service is completely disabled or not, which almost none of them are. And you can see in the Services Manager that many of these services are set to startup type as manual. So they're not even starting up with Windows. So just because there's a checkbox in Autoruns does not mean that it's starting up automatically. So don't really use that as a guide at all. Just use it to literally find a list of the services in Autoruns and then kind of look at it in the services menu. So once you do look in Autoruns and find a program that you specifically know that you do not want to be starting with Windows, you can then go into the services main management console and see if it actually is indeed indeed starting with Windows or not in the first place. And you can tell that if it says either automatic or automatic delayed start. And then the way to change that is you can right click it and then go to properties, and then you can change it from automatic to manual if you want. In any case though, again, the most important thing is if you do not know what a service does, then just don't touch it. Err on the side of caution. And remember, a lot of times the services are separate from the program itself, so it's not like the service is going to be necessarily using as many resources as the main program, probably not. So unless you know what you're doing, probably the best way to use this is just if you already are looking for a program that you know is starting up and you don't want it to, then you can find it in here and disable it. But you don't have to necessarily go through and disable every single possible startup thing. It's not really necessary. But of course, if you do disable something and things start to act weird, you can always put it back, but you might want to do things one by one so you can kind of recognize that. All right, so now let's move on to take a look at some of the other tabs. For the drivers tab, just don't even touch anything in here. Your PC components are going to rely on most of these, but it might still be interesting just to kind of look at. The Codecs tab is for things that do encoding and decoding of audio and video files. You might not have even known that they had their own little programs, but again, I would probably not mess with anything in here. The Office tab basically looks to be for like add-ins and plugins and stuff for Microsoft Office. So maybe if you have some program that automatically installed some kind of Office plugin that you're annoyed by, you might be able to find it in here and disable it. For Internet Explorer, this is pretty much obsolete. I don't really know anyone that still uses that. But next we have the Explorer tab, which is actually kind of interesting. For the most part, you probably don't want to mess with this too much. It basically shows you different add-ons and extensions for Windows Explorer. For example, sometimes you may notice if you install a program and then it adds an option to the context menu when you right-click stuff, then that will probably show up in this tab. All right, so those are all the different tabs that I'm going to at least mention in this video. If you want to look up the other ones, you can do that yourself. So now let's talk more about using autoruns in general and some of the features here, which are very useful actually. So when you right click on different entries in a bunch of the different tabs, you'll have a bunch of different options. So for example, one is check VirusTotal, which basically scans the file with like 70 different antiviruses. VirusTotal is actually owned by a Google subsidiary. So if you want to check if something is malicious, you're not sure, you can send it to VirusTotal and see how many get flagged. Though keep in mind, if there's like one positive result out of the 70 or something, it's probably a false positive. You can also right click a group to scan all of them at once with VirusTotal, or you can actually use an option to scan literally everything, but we'll get to that in a second. The jump to entry will take you to the registry entry of that particular item, though again, I would probably recommend not doing that unless you know what you're doing. And jump to image will just take you to the actual file. And as for the delete option, obviously I would recommend against using this. As far as I know, there's not really any way to undo it, so not something you probably want to do. At the top, there's a bunch of options. For example, you can change which user is active, so to show you the startup programs for just a particular user. And also for category, this basically just lists all the different tabs, but it might be easier to find since it doesn't move the tabs all around when you click them. Now we have the options menu, which is definitely useful. So we already saw the options to hide Windows and Microsoft items. But if you go to scan options, this will actually let you run checks and scans on everything at once. And in here, you do have some options, for example, per user locations, excludes system-wide startup stuff, so maybe leave that disabled. The verify code signatures checks if a program is signed and known and if it matches that signature, but I'll explain what that is more in a bit. Check VirusTotal, we already saw that, or you could choose to only check unknown images or files. And then to do the scan, you hit rescan, even though it might not have scanned anything in the first place. And now we can just wait for the scan to finish and repopulate all the different lists. In the VirusTotal column, this will show you how many positives it got out of about 75. If it's not 0, it'll show as red. And you can actually click on the result, which will take you to the VirusTotal details page. And it might even have a community score for whether or not it's been voted safe or not, though take that with a grain of salt. Again, if it says just 1 out of 70 positive results, then probably it's a false positive. And even like 2 to 3 or a couple more might still be false positive depending on what the program does. For example, here's one that was a false positive literally on a official Apple update program, and it's a verified signature, so it is legit. And you'll probably notice if you do check the programs that do have positives, if it's like 1 out of 74, a lot of times it's going to be probably the same different couple antiviruses that have a lot of false positives, and you can kind of judge that yourself. Anyway, another option at the top under options is to actually filter out any that do have 0 hits. One thing I'll point out is you'll notice in autoruns a lot of the yellow lines, that is basically for entries where a file is missing. A lot of times this is going to be from programs that didn't properly uninstall themselves completely and just kind of left stuff around. Although unless you actually know what a program is and you're sure that you uninstalled it, you might not want to just mess with these and just kind of ignore them. Finally, anything where the whole line is highlighted as red means that the program doesn't have a publisher certificate, aka a code signing certificate. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. For a lot of small software projects, this is actually kind of relatively normal. A publisher certificate is something you have to buy, and you basically get a special key that you can use to sign all the programs and exe files and whatever that you create and then publish. And the idea is that key and the certificate gets registered with a root authority that is trusted by like Windows, so you can tell whether or not the program has been modified from the original published by the developer, or the developer is actually the developer that is registered. But the thing is, these certificates can be pretty expensive, at least like $200 a year. Depending on what you're registering with, it might be hundreds or I think possibly even thousands. So a lot of times, small individual developers might just not even bother registering it. However, if there is an entry that is by like a big well-known company or something, and it still says not verified, that might be something worth investigating. And also in that case, probably look at VirusTotal to see if there's any malicious. And if you're interested, I would actually recommend checking out another video created by Mark Rasinovich, who actually created the Sysinternals suite and actually happens to be the current Microsoft Azure Chief Technology Officer, so he's kind of a big deal. He actually made a video talking about malware hunting using the Sysinternals suite. Now, it does definitely get kind of technical at certain points. You don't have to necessarily understand it all. You maybe just watch it and pick up a few things here or there. And I'll just have that link pop up through YouTube if you want to check it out. So by now, you should have a pretty excellent understanding of the different ways that a program might be starting up with Windows. So if you are looking for how something keeps starting up, you can't figure it out, by now you should be able to definitely find it. Also, thanks again to Blinkist for sponsoring this video. Again, you can go to blinkist.com/TheoJoe for a 1-week free trial. So you can check that link in the description. Now, if you guys want to keep watching, the next video I'd recommend is one I made actually kind of a long time ago, talking about 13 of some of the best Sysinternals tools that I went in a little bit more in depth into. I'll put that link right there. So definitely check that out. If you guys want to subscribe, be sure to enable notifications with the bell, because I make videos about twice a week. You don't want those to get lost in the rest of your subscriptions. And also, if you liked the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.